Resettlement to Redress, the rebirth of the Japanese American community, is made possible by the Henry and Tomoye Takahashi Charitable Foundation, Monica Young and Adrian Arima, and the members of KVIE.
It was my three brothers, my parents, and my grandfather. We drove out of Manzanar. There's a very strange sense that I had about that, because to me the fence was always the point at which danger lay, because I was always told as a kid, don't ever try to get outside the fence. And we knew that people had gotten shot. I had the sense that that was America out there. And America to me was a dangerous place. As we were driving out, my father said, don't ever forget this place.
As most of America was celebrating the end of World War II, Japanese Americans who were forcibly placed in concentration camps were facing an uncertain future. They would return home to cities like Seattle and Los Angeles and move to new places like Salt Lake City and Denver. For all, there would be hard times ahead, trying to rebuild the lives and the community that had been lost.
We walked by the Sentry Gate there at Heart Mountain, and they opened up the swinging barbed wire fence and allowed us out. Then we walked down the hill to the road, to the highway there. We just waited on the side of the road for the Continental Trailways bus to come along.
We basically came out of camp with a couple of suitcases. We had nothing. So we were really starting from scratch. I often wonder how my parents were able to even cope with it.
My father did have a hard time finding a job. He told me that he finally did get a job at a garage. He was an auto mechanic. People would bring their cars in and they would tell the owner of the garage, I want my car fixed, but I don't want that Jap to work on my car.
I can recall riding back home on a truck with my dad and sort of plaintively asking him, isn't Jap just an abbreviation of Japanese? And him looking across and saying, no, I'm sorry, I'm afraid not, I said, oh.
Japanese Americans were actively discouraged from reestablishing Japantowns, so they responded by congregating in churches, temples, and social centers. The Chicago Resettlers Committee was a model organization that helped the community members reestablish their lives through housing and employment support. Readjustment was especially hard for the first generation, the Issei, who had lost the prime of their adult lives.
There was difficulty finding housing. There was difficulty finding employment. And so I think that was the initial purpose of the committee, trying to help those coming out of camp. And that's why it was called Resettlers, because it was a way to help people settle again in these communities.
Pat Imino fondly recalls the popular annual picnics that the Resettlers Committee hosted.
Oh, it was almost like the picnics we used to have in Los Angeles when I was a little kid. And they'd have races and you get prizes and dancing, Japanese dances afterwards. It was really a social event, one of the big social events of the year. So we all look forward to that.
For many of the younger second generation, or the Nisei, the sports and social clubs were the center of the community.
Well, this fella named Tom Yokoi, he was our coach, and he decided he wanted all tall players on this one team. And I was so dumb. I mean, I didn't care, just so I played. So there we were with, we had about 6 girls who were 5, 6 and over, and some short ones too, but they were the better players. The only good thing about me was my height, and so all I had to do was hold the ball up here. Nobody could reach it and shoot, which, that's a no-brainer.
Still, racism was not far away. Kyo Fujio recalls a very painful story after her infant son, Timothy, passed away.
Well, when the funeral director contacted the crematorium at the cemetery, they said, well, no, they could not, handle that because he was Japanese. I think it's part of our Japanese upbringing that you carry those deep feelings inside yourself, and you try to make the best of it. The thing for me was, so long as you are white, the cemetery would be open to cremation, to have a person buried in that cemetery. But this infant, who has not even had an opportunity to make a mark in the world, cannot be cremated, cannot be buried in the cemetery because he is Japanese. I mean, talk about facing all the incarceration that we experienced, and then to experience how virulent that is.
In Seabrook, New Jersey, Japanese Americans were offered an early opportunity out of the camps. Beginning in 1944, Seabrook Farms recruited Japanese Americans as laborers to support the food producer in their wartime production for the military. Nearly 2,500 Japanese Americans and 200 Japanese Latin Americans helped Seabrook Farms become one of the largest frozen food companies in the world.
We went to the same kind of barracks that we left in the camps. There were the tar paper on the sides and no running water in the house. So it was exactly like what we had in camp. So I was very disappointed in that. For me, it was fun because then I didn't mind working. We've always worked ever since we were little. I used to like the packing line because everything used to be by hand. They had the cellophane and you did the cellophane first and everything was just automatic because I used to watch the other ladies, the four ladies, like Margaret. And Margaret was on the sorting side, and Chicky, the other girl on Monday, is on the packing line. And she had the fastest hands you ever saw. And so I would watch them and watch how they would do it. And then so I got to be pretty good.
The plant worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 10 months of the year. The father worked on one shift and the mother worked on the other shift. Well, Mr. Seabrook and the company then devised the community house, which organized all of the activities of the children during the daytime.
Ellen Nakamura was instrumental in convincing Japanese Americans to move to Seabrook. But early on, it was tough trying to convince people to move there.
Despite the fact that she told the people it was a nice place to come to, an acceptable place, not a nice place, nobody would come.
Ellen was so enamored with Seabrook that she wouldn't agree to marry her fiancé, Kiyomi, until he agreed to move there. He did, and so began the rich history of the Japanese community in Seabrook. Their son, Kenan, was born there, officially as the first Japanese-American baby in Seabrook, New Jersey.
There were 2 months of the year, January and February, when there was no work. And so that's when a lot of the community activities occurred. The Japanese became very well known for the New Year's open house, and all of the other rest of the communities learned to go from house to house to enjoy the gotso that was there. There would be the mochitsuki making, in which they had these handmade wooden things and the wooden mallets, and they would pound the mochi before the mochi machines were invented. And we used to stand by and marvel at the fact that Mr. Yamamoto would be turning over the mochi, not getting hurt.
The 1950s was a decade of achievement for Japanese Americans. After being singled out during the war, most were driven to blend in and excel. With that drive for achievement came a new label for Japanese Americans, the model minority. The Japanese American Citizens League, or the JACL, was a key supporter of integration. They lobbied for issues such as naturalized citizenship rights for all Issei and other Asians.
What we learned coming out of those camps as kids was that our survival was really based on how well we could assimilate. We never understood assimilation as such, but what we understood was that every time you were on the school grounds and you used a Japanese word, you got the crap kicked out of you. So after a while, you stopped speaking Japanese.
There were more Japanese American families around me, but there weren't as many kids growing up. And so, in a way, because there weren't that many of us of our age, we're able to integrate pretty easily. If you're successful in a small town, you do get a sense of confidence and self-esteem.
They were out to prove that they were more American than anybody else. They changed their names, they gave up they quit using their Japanese names, they took American names, they stopped speaking Japanese. You know, the JACL, I mean, you know, they pledge allegiance to the flag with a vengeance.
It might be that we felt guilty about something we shouldn't have felt guilty about, you know. Because usually you're thrown into prison for doing something wrong. And maybe we felt that somehow we were wrong, whereas the government was really wrong. I have to admit, myself, I wasn't very proud to have a Japanese heritage after World War II. It only brought me trouble for being Japanese American. It was only after about 20 years after the war I felt, oh, you know, I had a great heritage. And at that point, then, you know, I felt more comfortable. These are pictures of my dorm friends there. They're all very successful people. Some of my friends like Art Sugiyama is a doctor, MD. Ron Hirohata's MD. Richard Kaneko is a big in advertising. We were sort of driven to trying to succeed after the war, I think. I don't think consciously, you know, you're trying to be a model. It just turned out.
Years later, the pain of the past was never far away.
On our honeymoon trip back to Wisconsin, I stopped at Heart Mountain. It was just a farm. It was like a farmland there. We just sort of went to where the gate was and just looked over the land. It was so peaceful. It was different because the camp wasn't there anymore. Yeah. I guess I was just curious, you know. And it was part of your life.
In Hawaii, the racial climate was different. Japanese Americans were a larger percentage of the population, and their status prevented them from being incarcerated in camps. But still, it was not perfect.
War came along and suddenly it opens our eyes to segregation. And then we realized that, my God, we were segregated in Hawaii in a much more subtle way. In Hawaii, for example, I would never think of asking a white woman to dance. And you hardly ever saw a white woman waitress. Hawaii is not that bad, but changes could be made. We felt that after going through this hell and having to pay with all this blood, I think we should make certain that we don't go back again. Most of the decisions made by the young men, I'm not going back to the plantation. I'm going to college, I'm going to get a better job, and see what I can make of this community.
In 1954 came a moment that would forever change Hawaiian politics. The state legislature had historically been controlled by Republicans. But what came to be known as the Revolution of 1954 launched the historic careers of Daniel Inouye, Spark Matsunaga, and Patsy Takemoto Mink.
The demography is one thing, the sheer number of Nisei voters and Sansei voters by this time. So that's a huge factor. The veterans coming back is another really, really important factor. But the third, indispensable, is the growth of the labor movement. So the ILWU and the fact that there were so many Japanese Americans who were workers and organizers and who knew how to organize and who took that skill into the Democratic Party.
Japanese American politicians on the mainland followed suit. First came the election of Norm Mineta as mayor of San Jose, California. He was the first Asian American elected mayor on the mainland and eventually became an influential member of Congress. That was followed later by the election of Bob Matsui in Sacramento.
And the mayor came to me and said, would you consider submitting your name for the city council vacancy? I said, well, I'd have to talk to my dad about it because I was in business with him in the insurance business. And he said, you know, there's an old Japanese adage about people being in politics, and you're going to be like a nail sticking out on a board. And you know what happens to that nail? It always gets hammered. And I've always remembered that because, Papa, you were right. You always get hammered.
The congressman who had represented the area for 26 years had decided to retire. So he called Bob up and said, you know, I'm going to retire, and you might consider running. He remembered when he was in college, I think he was probably either a freshman or a sophomore, when John Kennedy became president. The words that he had about service was important to Bob, and it just ignited a spirit of public service in a whole generation of young people at that time. There are not too many times in your life when you might just kind of stop and say, you know, if we don't do this, will we regret it?
Outtakes from Bob Matsui's campaign commercials illustrate humorously a family becoming public for the first time.
Say, master shot, take one. You don't want to do it now? Okay, well, have your mom do it then. Boy, we were counting on you though.
Okay. Yes,
Oh, okay.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, you make up your mind.
I don't think
Are you going to help us this time, or do we have to depend on Mom?
Mom.
Okay.
Is that 5? Master shot number 14.
America needs new statesmanship. Our leaders have postponed decisions for too long.
We have a good life here in Sacramento with our many friends and our family. There's only one reason for us to go to Washington, and that's so Bob can help make those decisions which affect the future of our son Brian and the future of other children.
Our parents have given us a better life than they inherited. We have a responsibility to give our children a new and better day.
Was that one right?
Oh, yeah.
We worked really, really hard, and there was this tremendous energy. I can still feel it today, that sense of joy and happiness, and the fact that we did it together, all of us in that room. And it was truly wonderful. It was wonderful.
10 months and 1 day ago, on January 6th, when I announced for this office, Doris and my son and my mother and father were in our living room. And since that time, we have met so many wonderful people. And I must say that whether I win or lose this election, this evening, these past 10 months will be the most wonderful moments of Doris in my life. So I want to thank all of you very much for being here and sharing this very beautiful moment with us. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Although Japanese Americans excelled after the war, it came at a high cost, forgetting the past.
I didn't know anything about the camps, although I heard about camps, because as my parents' friends would come over, they would say, oh, what block was he in? What camp? And so I just thought this was a huge summer camp or something. It never really dawned on me.
You know, when people would ask you where you were born, and I would tell them I was born, you know, in a camp, in a concentration camp in the United States, most of the non-Japanese kids didn't believe me.
In the 1960s, change was all around. Society was in upheaval, and the generations were at odds. For Japanese Americans, it was often no different. Many of the third generation, or sansei, didn't want to follow the expected proper roles their more traditional families prescribed.
I think the 60s probably created some problems between generations. You know, I became a very rebellious teenager. There were other Japanese American kids who were doing the same thing.
Anything that I was told that was good for me, I was involved in the opposite. There was like a few of us that just weren't interested in that, and we were more orientated to the moment.
I got busted for shoplifting. I was stealing some meat at a market once, and then the guy caught me. And he made me come to the market, and I had to mop the floor every day for, I can't remember, it was maybe a week or 2 weeks. And then the only thing he kept saying to me was, God, Japanese don't do this. And I said, well, this one did.
I was getting kind of tired of, you know, just dropping reds, you know, and got to a point where we were starting to shoot them up and, you know, just killing time and getting together and hanging out and not really doing anything kind of new.
Revolution has come. Off the page. Time to pick up the gun. Off the page. Revolution has come. Off the page.
A group of activists created a movement of their own, the Asian American Movement. Their work led the push for ethnic studies, political empowerment, and resistance against community redevelopment.
I woke up one morning, you know, very, very dissatisfied with just my existence. And so I dropped everything. I sold my studio to my partner, grew my hair long, and put on my old field jacket and kind of joined the movement. And, you know, I never looked back.
You could talk about things that hadn't been talked about before. You could express your opinions. You know, there were lots of movements going on, and you could join them if you wanted to. It was to me, a very liberating time.
Everything was new. Everything was an experiment, you know, and that was, I think that was part of the anxiety, but also part of the joy. For the first time to hear like Yellow Power or Yellow Brotherhood was amazing, you know, it was really exhilarating.
During that time, the Black Panthers walked into the state capitol, and they were armed, and I said, well, we said we need to form our own group. We came and we said, we're the Yellow Brotherhood.
The Yellow Brotherhood's goals were to eradicate drugs, help kids academically, and assist in mending differences with their families. They were based out of a home, converted into a community center. Victor Shibata was part of the original group, while Nick Nagatani joined after he returned from Vietnam.
Our friends' younger brothers and sisters were dying of drug overdoses. So we said, this is where our focus is. This is what we want to do.
I think there were like people that were like, you know, not feeling good about being Asian.
In the community before the camps, they would have had something for that. They felt this energy, this positiveness. And then wherever we would go, you know, we were always respected.
The idea for a pilgrimage back to Manzanar was proposed. Pilgrimages would prove key in helping the community begin to face the pains of World War II.
I didn't really have an inkling of how it would impact on me. I just said, that's a great photo op. The moment when I started shooting there at the pilgrimage, that was the moment that I realized I have to do a film. I think it was very cathartic, and almost subconsciously I knew what I wanted to do. And that was to visually paint a picture of my ambivalence.
I remember crying, and finally my dad coming out
and taking me inside. After that incident, he got a piece of redwood from someplace and carved our name on it, and I couldn't really read at that time. So he put a huge index finger pointing to the name Nakamura, and I was able to find our barracks by that sign.
Georgette Imura recalls her trip to Tule Lake.
We were in a bus and we were driving out to the site. I'm sitting next to my mother-in-law. She's holding my son in her lap. And just looking at her, you know, made me wonder, what did she feel as a young mother? There was one incident that really struck home for us, why we were there. There were a few of our group who were walking down the street, and someone drove by in a car and said, "You're on the wrong side of the ocean. Go back where you belong." That really sent a strong message home for us. And I think going to the area and seeing the remnants of the barbed wire, the guard tower, you know, realizing that there were armed soldiers in that guard tower at one time who were prepared to shoot and kill anybody who tried to go over that fence or went near that fence.
The idea for redress and reparations was proposed to obtain an apology and compensation from the U.S. government for its actions during World War II.
Well, Edison Uno, who is very active in the Japanese-American community, somewhere started talking about redress. And it's like a drumbeat. And it just started, and Edison was the lone voice. But as he kept talking, people kept saying, "Yeah, sounds right." And so it started gaining momentum.
Edison would say to me, "Come on, join the J cell. This is where it's going to happen if anything's going to happen." In my view, it was impossible to get this kind of legislation passed, that it would never happen. It had never happened before in this country.
The prospect of something like this getting passed, I thought, was very, very remote. But, you know, it's like anything else. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. With the kind of support that was building within the community, it was something you just had to do.
And so I asked for a meeting in Washington, and it was in January of '79. It was Senator Dan Inoue from Hawaii, Spark Matsunaga, the junior senator, Norm Mineta, who was a ranking member in the House, and Bob Matsui, who had just gotten elected. We're standing around, and Inoue walked in, and Mineta walked in, and Matsui was there. And Inoue turned to Clifford and said, "Doctor, you're presiding." And he told him, you have the head chair. Clifford didn't know what to do. He was dumbfounded. It was really amusing because he's a very humble man. And he stumbled around, and finally I said, "Damn it, Cliff, get over there and sit down." The conversation went on for about half an hour about the merits of one or the other, and then Inoue spoke up and he said, "Have you fellas thought about a commission?"
I strongly recommended a commission, which in the beginning they all were against. "Oh, why waste your time?" I says, "I think it's worth it."
When Dan Inoue said, "Have you fellas thought about a commission?" my heart dropped because I didn't want to take a soft approach. I was determined we were not going to accept that. We were going to go after money.
In a way, I felt like an outsider. Me telling those who spent time in a camp what they should receive and what they should do is almost insulting. You know, I was ready to say, okay, you do it your way, but I felt that their way was not the right way. And so I did something I shouldn't do. I was a senior politician, so I conducted myself as a Japanese would do. I'm the Oyapun, you know? That's wrong.
And then Inoue put his arm around Matsui and he said, you fellas come up with that legislation, and I'll guarantee you the next session, this young man, my friend here, will not be in the Congress. He will not get elected. And there was something about the way he said that seemed to have a lot of political wisdom to it. The most disappointing thing to me was when we announced what we had done, and it was announced in our newspaper the following day. The criticism was awful. I mean, it was really harsh. It was ugly.
Those opposed to the strategy echoed complaints of the JACL's actions during World War II. Many felt the JACL was reviving a cautious approach that pandered more to the interests of the U.S. government instead of the needs of the Japanese community. Throughout the redress movement, different groups proposed different versions of redress bills.
For many of us, Sansei, I think we felt that things were moving way too slowly. We didn't want this commission and the hearings, and we didn't want it dragged out over years.
The commission so far has heard the testimony of between 400 and 500 people in the towns we have held, in which we have held hearings so far. The outpouring of information has been tremendous. Concern was expressed about finally clearing the record. A major part of the Commission's work should be to ensure that this bleak part of our history will never be allowed to be repeated in the future.
By that time, I had done enough research and talked to so many people to know that people had a lot of things to say about camp. You know, whether they would or not was another story, but they had a lot inside.
I remember distinctly several relatives telling me not to talk about that. It was in the past and don't bring it up. It's those same relatives, I think years later, who were some of the staunchest supporters of redress and reparations.
It turned out that the Niseis didn't need any prompting at all. You know, when the time came, their stories came forth, you know, just like an avalanche.
We were loyal Americans who had been stripped of all rights and privileges of our citizenship, taken from our homes and our homes taken from us. What would happen next? Were we to stay there forever and rot? We didn't believe this could happen to us yet. Here we were in America, the land of the free, and the unbelievable was happening. It is mind-boggling to try to arrive at a financial redress figure. How can you put a figure on a price on what we suffered? Henry Jackson has said, Washington State Senator said, quote, I question seriously whether you can provide monetary settlement for a problem that goes beyond that kind of solution. However, since it apparently was easy for the government to uproot thousands of Japanese Americans and their parents, I suggest it will not be difficult to arrive at a fair settlement. I suggest to Senator Jackson, try.
It is time that the Commission hears someone speak up in defense of the United States, its institutions, and the leaders who kept us a free nation during a time of peril. I state as a matter of fact and law that the United States committed no, quote, crime, unquote, that compels merits or suggests redress or reparation. Certainly there is no need to consider redress to interned resident aliens, and as for interned citizens, it's one of the burdens of citizenship, as pointed out by Karamatsu at 323 U.S. 219-220. All citizens alike, both in and out of uniform feel the impact of war in greater or lesser measure. Citizenship has its responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cade.
目が薄くなって目も読めないので子供に読んでもらおうと思います。
My name is Masao Takahashi. I am 87 years old and 3 months. I first came to the United States in 1913. My eyes are very dim in my old age now, and I am asking my daughter to read my testimony for me in English. 40 years ago, I held a job as a cannery foreman in the Alaska Fishing Company. My earnings were considered high wages among my fellow immigrants. I had many friends and a good standing in the community. I lived in a comfortable house with my wife and 4 daughters. On the very day of my eldest daughter's 11th birthday, February 21, 1942, I was roused from my sleep very early in the morning. The FBI ransacked my house. Apparently, I was part of the second group of men to be taken by the authorities. My family came to visit with regularity. I remember a friendly guard teasing my visiting 5-year-old daughter by slamming the barred gates closed and telling her that she was now a captive. She flew into my arms joyfully, saying, "Oh boy, now I could stay with Papa." Mama had tears in her eyes, and I wish that I could cry too.
I want America to live up to the democratic principles it stands for. I want America to admit and correct a terrible wrong. I want America to reaffirm that being an American is a matter of heart and mind, that it is not a matter of race or creed.
Suddenly it was like a dam breaking. And to hear these men and women who ordinarily would be very quiet and reluctant to even mention the place of incarceration, coming out in detail of what they felt. And that shook up the commission.
I think the idea of Senator Inoue to form the commission really was the start of the success.
Mr. Chairman, on a personal note, if I may make an inquiry. Mr. Takahashi, were you the foreman up at Kodiak Island?
Yes, he was.
Do you remember a young fellow from the state of Washington in the summer of '41 who worked up there? You're speaking to him now. As I recall, Mr. Takahashi, you were rather chubby. Your father was rather chubby at that time.
I will explain to him later. He's quite deaf as well as very
all
dim in
right.
the eyes. All right, thank you, sir.
I'll speak to him later.
Okay.
It was an incredible time when just everybody started buzzing about their camp experience, people who had not testified and people who did testify.
It's hard to imagine having to resurrect those experiences from such a long time ago and to do it in such a public forum. It was something tremendous that the Nisei had done for all of us.
You know, for myself, you know, I helped, my mother testified sort of on behalf of all of her brothers and sisters. So I helped her put the testimony together, and it was an incredible time, brought together all my aunts and uncle, and they sat around a table. Yeah, so for me, it was terrific because this was the first time I had heard so much about what had happened to my family.
My father was in the nursery business, and it was considered at that time in 1942 to be one of the largest in the Southern California area. He had 20 acres on choice land of Wilshire and Sepulveda. At that time, he expressed to my older sister that he had at least worth $1 million worth of nursery stock. We estimated it at $200,000 because at the time we had to get rid of this at a very quick notice. And my mother on her own with our father taken to Missoula was not able to consult him. We didn't know what to do. You cannot get rid of large nursery stock at this short notice. And so what did she do? But she gave all of the nursery stock to the U.S. government, the Veterans Hospital, which was adjoining the nursery. So this is one of the primary goals of my testimony here, is to express the great loss and the how my dad was broken in spirit and disillusioned, and when he came back, he was doing gardener's work and never again regained that economic success or the pride that he had before.
It took everybody's effort. I think from elected officials down to, people who just supported it. But, I think it was a tremendous community-wide effort.
Helping to bring out, I think, more involvement by our own community around this issue, and I think helped to reinforce the idea that redress and reparations was something that, win or lose, was something that, was so important to fight for.
They were getting their friends to write. They would tell them what happened to them and tell them their own personal stories and say, I need your help. I need you to write to Congressman so-and-so and help me. And so they were building their own little coalitions. The model worked from the top, but it really came from the bottom up. And so it was a true grassroots campaign in that sense.
I remember going to Congressman Claude Pepper, the chair of the Rules Committee, and he said, and who got put in the camps? I said, all those of Japanese ancestry. How do you prove you are of Japanese ancestry? And I said, 1/16 blood. And he stopped, he said, that's what the Nazis used against the Jews. So he said, I'll co-sponsor the bill. But when I reintroduced the bill in the new Congress, I wanted to use the bill number as 442, H.R. 442, to memorialize the 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
To my colleagues, I'd like to first express my deep expression of thanks to the leadership on both sides of the aisle for the opportunity to have this bill up on the 17th of September 1987.
It's ironic that many of my Japanese American friends have told me that they don't want the money. They're not interested in the $20,000. And I simply ask then, if that is the case, why are we voting money? Why can't we simply say we're sorry and leave it with that matter?
I would plead with my colleagues, as much as you wish to revisit history and to apologize for the actions of the United States, don't make them worse than they were. Acknowledge what happened. These were not concentration camps. These were not torture camps. This was not Nazi Germany. This was not the Holocaust. This was not the Armenian genocide, and we do a disservice to those who came before us when we suggest that it was.
Trucks came to pick up my friend. I would never forget the vision of fear in the eyes of Roland, my friend, and the pain of leaving home. My mother, as bright as she was, try as she may, could not explain to me why my friend was being taken away as he screamed not to go. And this 6-year-old black American child screamed back, "Don't take my friend."
I was born in this country, as were most of those who were interned. Yet at that time, even citizenship was not enough if your parents or grandparents had come from Japan. So on May 29, 1942, my father loaded his family upon that train under armed guard, which was taking us from our home in San Jose to an unknown distant barracks. He was later to write to friends in San Jose, and he wrote in that letter about his experience and feelings as our train pulled out of the station, and I quote, "I looked at Santa Clara Street from the train over the subway. I thought this might be the last look at my loved home city. My heart almost broke, and suddenly hot tears just came pouring out. And the whole family cried out. We could not stop until we were out of our loved county." End of quote. We lost our homes. We lost our businesses. We lost our farms. But worst of all, we lost our most basic human rights.
Also key to the success of the redress movement were the landmark reversals of the wartime convictions of Fred Korematsu, Min Yasui, and Gordon Hirabayashi. The three had previously been convicted by the government for resisting camp incarceration.
This is a day we've waited for 40 years, to have our day in court, to have our opportunity to let our side of the story be heard. To this date, up to now, there has not been a judicial declaration that what was done to Japanese Americans was wrong and unconstitutional. I think that has changed today with the judge's order and the judge's opinion.
What happened 40 years ago, bringing it up now, it involved my family and my personal life, and I had to do some real deep thinking in order to reopen this case again, and I am very happy that I did, because this is not only for just the Japanese American citizens, but it's for all American citizens.
We needed this in order to, I think, clear away 40 years of guilt and shame, in order to set the record straight, the historical record straight, in order to finally vacate a conviction, get rid of a conviction that Fred Korematsu has lived with for 40 years.
President Ronald Reagan signed H.R. 442 on August 10, 1988. The achievement by the Japanese American community and their supporters resulted in a historic accomplishment, an apology that internment was based on racism, and $20,000 towards reparation.
Thank you all very much. The members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
We'd gone up to the Northwest, and we're driving down some old back roads of Oregon, and it came on the news that Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. And I thought, wow, amazing. It is incredible. People don't realize it now, but they'll realize one day that this is something really magnificent.
Part of the victory was just people being able to come to terms with it themselves. So part of what gave me such a lump, I guess, was hearing the testimony themselves. And I knew that just putting them into words would be important for them and for us.
And to read that H.R. 442, and that the Congress, on behalf of the American people, apologizes. What nation ever apologizes for their mistakes? The fact that here's a country that sees a wrong, accepts blame for it, and redresses for that wrong. And so to me, that's the strength and the beauty of this country.
Vindication, I think, for all the hard work and the belief that, not so much that the system worked, but that belief that, you know, our need to reclaim our history, you know, was really possible.
I was sad because my grandmother had passed away a few years before that, and I remember when she was sick, the redress movement or the redress bill had just been introduced, and the movement was really underway, and she had told me that she was going to live long enough to get her redress check, and she didn't, and so that made me very sad.
It's never a closure. I don't think it's a closure on the camp experience, but it did heal, I think, some wounds to have the government just acknowledge it. And I don't think it was the money. It was just the acknowledgement on behalf of the government that it was wrong.
I think I made peace with it, yeah. Because in a way, okay, our life changed a lot, and we were given opportunities, right, that we couldn't have. So I think I recognize that, things have changed.
To live one's life having always to prove that you're more than what you look like on the outside. To always have to work harder to prove yourself in some ways. So, in a sense, it was final recognition at the highest level that the experience we had to endure was really based on racism. For me, it means that there is some hope.
It was sort of a coming to terms with America and with ourselves. It was a moment when we had to face our own shame, our own sense of shame, but knowing that we had no way to control what was happening to us. And then finally, some 40 years later, we had the guts to do something about it. And that was when we were able to face it. And that's when the principle and the sort of the star out there that we were aiming for shone a little bit brighter for us. And when Reagan signed the bill, for us to feel like, you know, we're finally home again after all these years.
For Japanese Americans, finally, they could begin to make peace with the past and look forward towards the future.
To order a DVD copy of this program, call 888-814-3923. The cost is $19.95 plus shipping and handling.
Resettlement to Redress, the rebirth of the Japanese American community, is made possible by the Henry and Tomoye Takahashi Charitable Foundation, Monica Young and Adrian Arima, and the members of KVIE.